Minister, Drury, ladies and gentlemen, and boys and girls. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this very, very special occasion. It brings me back to a strange time in my own life. When John and I first met, it was 1975. I had just arrived from Belfast to work in Trinity College, having survived an attack by loyalists on our home, the bombing of our pub by loyalists in which a young woman was killed, an attack on a pub my father had an interest in by the IRA, in which again we mercifully managed to escape injury, and leaving behind the devastation of a city that had become manic, a city in tribal conflict. And so I arrive in Dublin thinking, thank God at last I'm safe. I managed to get up the stairs. John, luckily, was on the floor below me. If you remember this, John, I don't tell this incorrectly, I think. John, I think because you were there before me, John managed to get the floor before me. I was given an attic in Pearse Street, you remember that, and it was about 6 flights up. And I arrived into this tiny office. I sat down at my very small desk, and right behind me there was, and you probably had a matching one, a cabinet, a metal cabinet, emblazoned on which were the words "Guaranteed Irish." And I sat down on my desk, and the first thing that happened was the 2 doors fell off and hit me. If that ever happened to you. Yeah, so you managed to escape that. So Dublin wasn't as safe a place as it's made out. So that's how far back John and I go. And I'm particularly privileged to be here to launch the book that he and Edward Madigan have edited. And the secret, of course, is in the title, Towards Commemoration. You don't mind if I use that, don't you? God, he's just ruined it. It's in every second word. Anyway, I'm going to use the word commemoration, whether you like it or not. And I mean, after this, I will, of course, submit to the discipline of centenaries. But in the meantime, I'm going to use the word commemoration. Because the secret is in the title, Towards Commemoration. You see, I'm old enough to remember, regrettably, the last big decade of centenaries, though, of course, and that was 50 years ago, really. Back in Belfast, when we had the decade leading up to the 50th anniversary of the Somme, the 50th anniversary of the Rising. And there were no clusters of people like there are today. There was no who are determined to take control of the process of commemoration. There was no Good Friday Agreement. There was no talk of parity of esteem. What there was just the raw tension of unreconciled, unhealed, fragmented communities struggling to try and find their way on a day-to-day basis to living with each other and clinging to commemoration. Clinging so strongly to commemoration that healing and reconciliation would be postponed for the best part of another 50 years. And frankly, if you've ever lived in a place that fell apart, if you've ever come home from school and wondered would you get home, if you've ever gone to bed at night and wondered would you waken up alive in the morning, would your father get home from work, if you've ever gone to sleep with a kind of a big chunk of concrete, as many people in Belfast did and many people in Northern Ireland did, and many people experienced the knock on the door and the police on the door with the bad news of what had happened, the sectarian killing, the bombing, all of that. If you've ever gone to bed, believe you me, you'll understand why this book is so important. And why those clusters of people gathered today who are determined that this decade of centenaries will be different. They will not be a slide into conflict. They will not be a slide into war. They will, in fact, be a test of us. They will be a test of us. They'll be a challenge to us. Because we're still arguing over all those centenaries and all those commemorations. We still don't have an agreed consensus on many of them, and we may never have. But what we do have is an agreed consensus around peace. And that has changed the shape of this decade. This holds this decade in a cocoon that is very different from the hermetically sealed little separate pockets with which, or in which and from which, we approached these decades, this decade of centenaries, and back then the 50th anniversary celebrations. Back then we approached them from sectional interests, from little fragments. And what this book tells me is we're not doing that anymore. We refuse to do that. So the secret is in the title, Towards Commemoration. The conference in Monaco back in 2011 wasn't just a gathering of historians with an academic interest in facts, alleged facts, skewed facts, disputed facts of historic events between 1912 and 1923, those events that created this raft of iconic memories for the people of this island and indeed these islands, not to mention our European neighbours, as John is very good at reminding us, and indeed Edward also reminding us. Stop always navel gazing, remember the broader picture. And those events, they fed the distrust and the estrangement that allowed neighbour and neighbour to live cheek by jowl in kind of baffled and dangerous ignorance of one another, particularly north of the border, but not just exclusively north of the border, right across this island and on these islands. And of course those events also cast ahead of them, whether they intended to or not, they cast ahead of them the toxic spores of sectarianism, of political hostility, into unlived futures, and they created in turn, of course, since then, a slew of even more new, iconic, more recent, blood-fueled memories of more innocent, more heroic, and more hated, dead, depending on your point of view. And we have watched as those toxic spores kept spilling over into generation after generation, one new unblooded generation becoming blooded. And it seems to me this book is saying we're not going to do that anymore. Just before one of the chapters, we were just talking about the chapter on commemoration, the section rather, not the chapter, but the section on commemoration. There's a blank page, and we were joking about it outside, and I would say perhaps that's one of the most important pages in the book, because this book is about the future. I think it was Fintan O'Toole said that, and the commemorations are as much about the future as about the past. And so this is what we, in a sense, gather in the launch of this book today to remind ourselves of. This was no ordinary academic gathering. It was actually quite extraordinary, because these men and women of standing in the academic firmament, in the civic firmament, were thinking ahead. They weren't just thinking back, They were thinking ahead to the decade of centenaries that we have not entered. We're actually, well down the road of it, and wondering how would they be, and importantly, how could they be commemorated? How could we survive the coming times with all the ghosts that are going to be stalking the landscape? Because commemoration does that, it stirs up the ghosts. And what was important, I think, to that gathering in Monaco, and which is important to so many clusters of people now, big clusters, thankfully, of people on this island, was to create a space in which those iconic memories, so respectfully and carefully set in aspic, so hermetically sealed by a sense of the sacrosanct, and indeed so often immunised from the incursions of objectivity or scrutiny, could, in Edward's own words, provide us with an unprecedented moment in which to learn about them and to remember them. Why? Because not to do so, to leave us inside those hermetically sealed bubbles, leaves us condemned always to be strangers to our neighbours. And that is not a good way to live. We've learned that. We have to have learned something these 100 years. We have to have, don't we? Today we approach, I think this book's very existence indicates that we have learned something these 100 years. And there are a lot of other things that tell us that too. In fact, the gathering, when I see some of the faces in the gathering, people who, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, might not have been in each other's company. Yes, we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot. Today we approach the decade of centenaries, not, I think, as a random set of individual initiatives, but as a community, very experienced now in the utterly exhausting work of peace building. We know what dangers we want to avoid. We know we have to talk. We know we have to talk about difficult subjects, things that divide us, and we have to talk about things that could continue to divide us dangerously if we let them, if we let the random simply take over. We've historically estranged groups working together, which is remarkable to me. We've people who never talked to each other before working on this decade. Why? Because they've learned a thing or two. We have them working in Northern Ireland, we have them working here. We have, as the Minister has said, the Taoiseach's All-Party Consultation Group on Commemoration. Oh, the Taoiseach hasn't heard. Look yet. He will, yes, undoubtedly. We have the completely new and changed concept and the landscape of thinking that is captured in the Good Friday Agreement and the rolling out, the continued rolling out of the Good Friday Agreement, the underpinning of the peace process. We have the devolved government in Northern Ireland, shared by Catholic, Protestant, Unionist, Nationalist, Loyalist and Republican. Remarkable. We have a healed relationship with Britain. Katrina Pennell pleads for the 21st century Britain, multicultural Britain, to deal with World War I history in a way that is not isolationist, parochial or inward-looking. So, we say that to our neighbours with respect, but we also say something very, very similar to ourselves. John, it is, Mashan Cara, who pleads with the Irish to remember the wider context of the Great War, part of a broader set of transformations. Yes, Ireland, as he says, had a particular place, but it was not unique. So let's try and broaden the horizon with the help of those who are genuinely committed to helping us struggle through these days, these months, these years, to make to write a better script on that blank page than was written 100 years ago, or indeed was written in any part of the last 100 years. So the importance of this book and the importance of the conference from which it emanated, believe you me, is not merely academic. It's not just about history or about memory, but about how we can consciously make a decision, communally, to change the shape of the future so that it consolidates the hard-won peace, so that it enhances the healthier relationships we have on this island between North and South, within those communities that live in Northern Ireland, between these islands. Many of our commemorative events, will you allow me that? Yes. Many of our commemorative events over the coming decades, they're capable of resurrecting neuralgic points of contention. And we have to be very, very aware of that, not run away from that and not be afraid of it. It's unlikely that even with the best will in the world, or the best of applied brain power, that we could arrive at a shared consensus about the facts of all these events, or the perspective on all these events. But the truth of the matter is, in this room, some of the people in this room are walking proof of it, in some cases we have actually very successfully unpacked and unpicked the historical record, the hermetically sealed one, in such a way that new possibilities for shared memory have emerged. I think particularly in relation to participation in the Great War, and there are some wonderful articles on that. I think that you have Heather Jones, you have Tom Hartley, Ian Adamson, Tom Burke, Brian Hanley, Keith Jeffrey. They all point up in different ways just how we have managed to flatten out that story and let a whole lot more people stand on that platform of memory. People who are surprised to find themselves in the company they find themselves in, and to find friendships there that have grown and blossomed remarkably. And then in other ways we've been able, by generosity and indeed by gesture, to heal some of the most contentious historic memories. I would think in particular of an event that's already been mentioned here, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth's visit to Ireland, and in particular her visit to the Garden of Remembrance and to Croke Park, events that Aaron Gary says they show that even the most divisive events can have a powerful, symbolic, conciliatory impact. And we shouldn't forget that, the power we have, just by gesture, just by touch, by gesture. It doesn't have to be long, rambling or long, deep and intensive apologies, but just by gesture, to show one another a depth of compassion and care that we now allow ourselves to have. Shortly after Queen Elizabeth's visit, she got the biggest post bag after that visit she ever got from any state visit, and similarly I too got the biggest post bag. But one letter, forgive me if you've heard this story before, one letter was, among the major letters, was one from a very elderly lady. She said, I'm a 90-year-old Republican. Oh God, I thought, oh God. I'm going to get it in the teeth now. And she said, I've no time for monarchs. And in particular, I'd no time for the monarch from that place next door. And she said, and I didn't think you should have invited her. But since you did, I thought, she said, and out of deference to you, she said, well, I watched the first 5 minutes on television anyway. And then she said, when the television hadn't been turned off for 4 days and had nearly spontaneously combusted, and she had cried. She said that when the Queen's plane lifted off from Cork Airport, she reflected on the 4 days, and she said she felt they were choreographed by the angels. And I thought it was a beautiful expression. Now, she only knew who choreographed it, they weren't very angelic. But they do say God works in mysterious ways and miracles to perform. But anyway, choreographed by the angels was a very nice way of summarising it for me. And so, in and through that, we felt the power of healing, of neighbour to neighbour, generous healing. And continuing that work, precisely because we now know the power of it, the reality of the power of it, that it is real, that it is not ephemeral, that it actually does change things, change thinking, change possibilities. Because we know that, we know we've got to keep on doing it. Continuing that work is absolutely essential. We won't cover off all the possible points of conflict, a point very well made by David Fitzpatrick, as he makes a stand for the interested bystanders, who can offer so much critical dissection that we don't want to have to listen to, because it would actually interfere with our edited history highlights. Nor will it stop us from editing history to serve our perspective. And Jay Winter has a beautiful piece on that. I recommend it to you. And it won't stop us from choosing who to commemorate, overlooking the people who choose not to commemorate anybody, to follow no flag. And actually Anne Dolan makes a particular plea for those silent sufferers among us. So how do we approach these commemorative events with a degree of reassurance that they will not drag us back, that they will at least do no harm, or possibly do something more? Do something more, and I think this is exactly what the conference is about and what the book is about, challenging us not to settle for a decade of centenaries that just doesn't make things worse, but actually maybe to come through it strengthened, even more reconciled, even more healed. Pierre Johanan talks about the hangover we might have at the end of the decade of centenaries, and I was thinking, how would we reduce that decade of headaches? John talks in his beautiful essay about the creative tensions that are possible now out of this decade, to actually make the tensions a source of creativity. And I believe the answer lies in the biggest change to our shared context, and that is the Good Friday Agreement. That's the changed context, the clearly expressed will for peace, so that this decade of commemorations is going to occur inside that structure, where we will must draw from the value system that we encapsulate really in two ideas. One is parity of esteem and the other is peace. And so that in all that we do, and in every way that we commemorate, in every way we structure the commemorations, in every way we explain them, and all the sensitivities that we use around language, that we decide that at the very least we're not going to do any harm, but maybe, just maybe, we could do something brilliant. Maybe, just maybe, we could stretch ourselves to show that we have, in and through this commitment we have to peace and parity of esteem, that maybe through this decade of centenaries, we can create the memory, a new iconic memory, of a community of good neighbours, of very, very diverse perspectives, who put their right to commemorate, which they have, at the service not just of commemoration, but of peace building. And then gave to future generations something truly remarkable, something absolutely wonderful to commemorate and to celebrate. And I think proving the truth of what Paul Clark says, that our history is more shared than we have ever been allowed to believe. I think we want to make that true now, and I think we have a great opportunity to make that true. I hope I've mentioned everybody who made a contribution to the book. I certainly intended to. I apologise if I left anybody out. But I have to say, for me, this book is the reassurance that this decade of centenaries is guided, maybe even choreographed, by the angels.
I think that is the most eloquent and moving book launch I've ever heard.